I just want to welcome everybody to this last session on day 2 of the symposium. This discussion is really going to be focused on community engaged research. I'm really excited to get to be the moderator for this really important panel that will be led by Dr. John Soske and Michelle McKenzie. So John and Michelle will provide a really comprehensive overview of community engaged research and some approaches happening in Rhode Island. And please kind of feel free to put in any comments or questions that you have in the chat box. There will be a Q&A after the presentation, and so we can address those then. So I just want to quickly introduce you all to both John and Michelle. So John is a person in long-term recovery from alcohol and drug addiction. He is currently a researcher based at the Lifespan Transitions Clinic and in the Special Populations Floor of the COBRE on opioids and overdoses here in Rhode Island. And Michelle is the Director of Community Engagement with the COBRE on opioids and overdose. And she is a harm reductionist, a person in long-term recovery, and has been conducting harm reduction research for more than 20 years. So with that, I will turn it over to you, John and Michelle, and I will be keeping an eye on the chat for folks as you have questions.
Thank you, Alex. I'd like to start by thanking Alex and Kali and all of the organizers, the COBRE, the Radar, the Cadre, everyone else. I also want to say I've been battling a cold and labyrinthitis for a couple weeks, so I'm really at like 50%. So I will do my best, but I have Michelle with me, and Alex has also played a pretty substantial role in the development of these discussions, and Colleen's here as well, who really started this discussion. So please feel free to step in if I start to falter. So what Michelle and I are presenting today is it's a year-long process that the COBRE has undertaken to develop a set of principles for what we're calling community-empowered research. We've recently presented this framework to the COBRE, and we've drafted a document that's currently under discussion. So we're closing in on the end of this process, but we're not yet there yet. So it's work in process still, and so we're really interested in people's feedback. The document is called Shaking the Tree of Science. The title comes from Tyrone McKinney, who is works at Project Weber Renew, which is a local harm reduction organization. And he gave it to us in our discussion of these principles at the Community Advisory Board. He said that he really said to us, he expects us to shake the trees and see what comes out from research for the community. And it was just such a beautiful image of what we're trying to do that we took it from him. Our basic concept is we've been developing principles to guide project development and project evaluation at key stages. So we really want to think about how to bring the voices of people who are directly affected into the design of research projects, the process of data collection, interpretation, and also dissemination. However, the idea is not just that this document and these principles will guide individual projects. They're really meant as a set of principles for the COBRE as a whole. And the ambition is to develop a long-term conversation between the COBRE and the communities that we work with over time, consulting with communities in the development of research, taking results back to them, and developing understanding and capacity on both sides. So in some ways, the document's inspiration comes really out of the harm reduction as a movement. In May 2008, there was a landmark document put out in Canada called Nothing About Us Without Us, which built on work that was done in disability activism and certainly work that was done by HIV/AIDS activists, but was the first major international statement by people who use drugs that they, and I should say we, deserve a central seat at the table in any discussion about addiction and recovery, but in particular research, that we had been the object of research, we had been the object of discourse, and the time had come to transform that so that we were actively involved in producing knowledge about our own communities and about our own experiences. And since then, there really has been a global movement to redefine community and research relationships. And I think this is especially coming out of Indigenous communities. And there's also a very rich tradition of sex worker activists and researchers also writing about the ethics of research and contesting the way sex workers have been researched. So in New Zealand, there are movements like the Indigenous data sovereignty as a movement. In Canada, you see a lot of pushback right now against how researchers are going into Indigenous communities and what the responsibility of outside researchers are. In Indigenous community, there was just a very powerful set of principles put out in South Africa by the San Indigenous peoples about how they expect research to be done in their community. So what we want to capture is this really a global discussion across multiple historically marginalized communities about their relationship with researchers. And we see the conversation about people who use drugs and people in recovery as part of this larger global conversation. But the immediate impetus for the process in Rhode Island was a document that was put out from Vancouver's downtown east side in 2019 called the Research 101 Manifesto. And as most people in this seminar will probably realize, Vancouver's downtown east side is one of the epicenters of Canada's overdose epidemic. It is also one of the epicenters of global harm reduction activism of people who use drugs. It is also a heavily over-researched community and a space with a powerful history of institutional racism, settler colonialism, anti-Indigenous violence. So out of these very tense discussions, a group of younger researchers and a group of activists and a group of people who use drugs came together and went through a process of putting together a manifesto that really speaks back to academia from the community. It's a powerful document. We would recommend everybody read it. And shortly after it came out, I circulated it to Michelle McKenzie and Colleen and a few other people locally. And Colleen had read it and said, we really need to do something like that here. And this really started the ball rolling to think about what would it take to adapt something like Vancouver's Research 101 Manifesto to our particular context. And I think it's also important to acknowledge that in doing so, we were building on years of work that have been done by researchers at the local level to develop really strong alliances. So Project Weber Renew has been a site of some very fruitful researcher activist engagement. So has RICARES. We've had a very strong recovery science harm reduction reading group that has been like 1/3 researchers, 1/3 people in recovery, 1/3 academics. There's the Work of the People, Places and Health Collective, which is very community-based and very community supportive. So there was a context for these discussions already that we were building on. So the process of development we went through is, first, we circulated, Michelle McKenzie and I circulated the Research 101 Manifesto to over 20 key community members for comments. And it was a very rich discussion and we got a lot of feedback. One of the major themes was that things are very different in Rhode Island. We are not the downtown east side. We have a different history. There are different racial politics. There are different relationships between the institutions and the community. So at first, we really were thinking we would adapt this document. And from the initial feedback, we realized that we had to create something of our own. We had to really draft something from scratch. Another really useful line of feedback we got, especially from people like AJ at Project Weber Renew, was that we needed to think a lot more about research serving advocacy ends, that often researchers are really interested in producing knowledge that feeds back into the academy and existing scientific and social scientific discussions. And that's often not what's most useful for communities themselves, which is to get knowledge in real time that can be put to work in legislative and other forms of advocacy. So this made us realize that this wasn't going to be a quick adaptation, and that we really needed to step back, draw in broader communities, and do full justice to the work that already had been done in Rhode Island. So we organized 3 public events from August to November 2020. The first event was a panel of local activists, including Dennis Baylor, Project Weber Renew, Alex Collins, who introduced us, was on this panel, Sarah Ziegenhorn of the Iowa Harm Reduction Coalition, a few other people nationally, to just start working over the idea of community engaged research and try to think about how we could radicalize it. What will it take to go from engaging the community to giving the community actual power in the research process? We then had an event where we invited some of the authors of the Vancouver Harm Reduction 101 Manifesto to speak to us. And coming out of that event, it was a complicated event, and Michelle and I thought we did not do a good enough job preparing it. And we also realized we were trying to sort of shoehorn really complicated discussions into a very set kind of academic format that wasn't doing justice to the discussions. And we also started hearing feedback from both events that researchers were finding the discussion overwhelming. We were talking about the ethics and the politics and the long-term relationship building, and we weren't giving people enough practical footholds to start this work, nor were we really capturing how, or we could have done a better job capturing how exciting and how much one gains from this work. So then we did a third event that was more like a hands-on set of workshops about where to get started. If you're interested in doing work with community organizations or community members, what are some initial steps you can take to get the ball rolling that more stressed the benefits of this kind of work rather than the pitfalls? We then decided on a format for our document that was 5 principles of community empowered research and 5 questions. We took these principles to the COBRE CAB. We then drafted a document coming out of the CAB that we took to the COBRE, and then since then have circulated that document for extensive feedback. So here are the 5 principles of community engaged research or 5 principles of community empowered research that we developed. First is that research should be co-determined by researchers and communities. And from community members we heard, we understand things about our communities that you likely don't. We know questions that are not in any books or journals. Our people will talk to us about struggles, joys, they rarely share with outsiders. As outsiders, you are only scratching the surface of our complex lives. Research should be community building. We know that researchers, and each of these quotes come out of the discussions that we had with different community members and partners. We know that researchers are often scrambling last minute to meet funding deadlines, but coming to us with a predetermined project or at the last minute is the least useful way to work together. We want you to take some time to get to know our communities and think creatively with us about how research can be empowering. Research should center marginalized voices. We want to be more than anonymous informants. We want to be recognized as co-producers of knowledge. You can invite us to present with you at conferences. You can credit us as co-authors. Researchers should return to the community. This was a major theme, kind of researchers come into our communities, solicit our time and effort, and then never return. It is the exceptional researcher that comes back. We want you to ask for help with the interpretation. We want you to talk to the community members about results. People said they wanted to know that there was going to be real long-term commitment. And then finally, our labor should be fairly compensated. Lived experience is expertise, emotional labor is work. When we talk to you about your grant idea, recruiting participants, serving on our study community, speaking to classes or university events, organizing community-based recruiting participants for your studies, we are doing skilled work that deserves compensation and recognition. The second part of our document is 5 questions that 5 questions that were consistently asked to us as the authors of this process, and 5 questions that community members or organizations regularly had for researchers that were working in their communities. First, is your approach trauma-informed? Have you carefully considered the ways that research can contribute to the individual or community trauma faced by marginalized communities at all stages: design, recruitment, payment, representation? Have you made sure that your research staff is adequately trained and informed in trauma-informed approaches to conducting research? Have you considered the hidden labor you are asking community members to perform? Are you asking for introductions to individuals, organizations, and community? Are you asking for assistance in promoting your study on social media, et cetera, et cetera? All of these things are work and they deserve compensation. Are you being tokenistic? Our definition of tokenism is representation without power. Are you including community members or organizations in a tokenistic or empowering fashion? Are you including people who are most directly affected or settling with community members or organizations who are the most visible and easy to work with? And this is something that I think Michelle and I have talked a lot about as being both people in recovery and researchers, and of course, white and highly privileged. In some ways, we are the easy people for researchers to go to and say, oh yes, we consulted and worked with people in recovery, because we speak the language, have an institutional credibility, and it can become a kind of surrogate that actually disguises all kinds of power relations. Are you making yourself accountable to the communities that you study? In what ways are you, and at what stages in your research are you bringing the process to the community for feedback? And finally, have you done your homework? Indigenous scholars, African-American civil rights leaders, drug users, unions, sex workers, and other activist groups have been warning about power differentials and the damages that researchers can cause in our communities for decades. Have you taken time to read their writings? Are you listening to intellectual voices and research frameworks from outside the university? So we've synthesized a document built around these 5 principles and 5 questions. And from this document, I'm going to pull out 4 things that I think are not totally unique about our process or approach, but are at least distinctive in terms of how we're thinking about the framework of community empowered research. And the first is, we're putting a lot of emphasis on the broader crisis of the relationship between scientific institutions and communities, especially biomedicine and communities. We are at a moment in this country's history where there is a deep crisis of medical mistrust, separating the biomedical sciences and public health from a variety of communities. Some of that is a right-wing revolt against science, built up by ethno-nationalism, which is genuinely globally. Some of that's deep mistrust in marginalized community that reflects generations and centuries of structural racism and the experimentation on people by the biomedical sciences. But we're trying to step back and think about what we're doing locally in terms of this much broader context of the breakdown in trust between scientific institutions and communities in our society. And of course, repairing this is going to be long, intensive, institutional work, but we really feel like community engaged research can be one place locally to take some steps to do that kind of reparative work. A slogan we've been working with is community-based research can also be community-based scientific education. As part of this, we're putting a greater stress on, in our work on the scientific utility of community engaged research. In these discussions, or community empowered research, in these discussions, there's a lot of emphasis on the ethics and politics and power relationships between community members and researchers. And of course, that's our starting point, and we think that's important. But we also feel like community engaged part of the argument for community engaged or community empowered research is it can produce better research. That the knowledge of communities is this rich, often untapped resource that is going to make our work more rigorous. And there is this kind of field that community engaged research among some researchers, there's this kind of field that community engaged research is kind of feel-good research or less rigorous research. But I think at this moment where we face still ongoing discussions about the replication crisis and serious issues with external validity and social sciences, that actually drawing on community engaged research can be a huge resource for thinking through issues like external validity and construct validity, and making our research more rigorous, more scientifically powerful. We're suggesting that we transition our focus from individual research projects to the long-term relationship between a community of research and the communities they work with. And if you think about it, you know, our way of talking about ethics in terms of research really is focused on individualized projects. For example, if institutional review boards look at ethical impacts of projects only on an individual basis. So if we go to South Providence, actually there are dozens and dozens of research projects being done in South Providence. They're done through different institutions. They're cleared through different institutional review boards. There is no mechanism for looking at the impact holistically. And so while we think, obviously looking at the ethics of individual projects is important, stepping back and thinking about the impact, at least of the COBRE as a whole, and its long-term relationship with communities is equally important. And we also think the benefits that I was talking about will come not just through an engagement at the individual project level, but through the process of a longer-term conversation. And finally, we've spent a lot of time talking about the importance of training and supporting translators, people with lived experience that also have research training. And I think our project has been as rich as it has because of people like Michelle, Haley, McGee, myself. There are people like Rich Holcomb of Project Weber Renew, who is a person with lived experience who's been working with researchers off and on for decades now. The fact that we in Rhode Island do have a set of people who, with lived experience, who are working on the front lines, who also have a very high knowledge of research. And we want to build that out. How do we create an infrastructure to train a new generation of people with lived experiences of incarceration, of homelessness, of substance use, of sex work, who can also be research assistants or go on to themselves become researchers? That also means recognizing the sometimes hidden lived experience that researchers in our community already have. And Michelle and I were challenged, and we think really productively, in presenting these principles for the first time by one of our fellow researchers who said to us, I have lived experience of racism. I have lived experience of homelessness, but because I don't identify as a person in long-term recovery, I feel like that's invisible in this space. So I think we also are trying to be more thoughtful of thinking about how do we acknowledge and make visible the kinds of lived experience that researchers do have that can enrich in this discussion, without denying at the same time still the huge power differentials that exist between researchers and many of the people in the communities that we work in. And with that, I will hand it over to Michelle.
There we go. Hello, thank you so much, John. Picking up on where John's presentation, and so and just to let folks know, I can imagine that there are questions with that. I will go through just a few more slides, and then we will open it up for questions. And actually, I have some questions for you too. So how are we hoping to actually make this happen more in the COBRE research community, the COBRE on opioids and overdose research community? So our next steps with the 5 principles and questions are to actually have it adopted by the executive committee. And we're actually we hope to implement integrating the 5 principles really with all of our investigators. And so we are inviting, or will be inviting, all of our investigators who apply for applications or for grants through the COBRE, and then of course people who were awarded grants through the COBRE to work specifically with the Special Populations Corps so we can offer training, support, and advice around really identifying how do you identify the community of your research, because there isn't one community. It really depends on the focus of the research, the experience of that each investigator brings to the research. And so the work of our core will be really to identify the community and to support the investigator in developing or really enriching the relationships that no doubt investigators have already begun to make, and sort of guiding what are next steps with regard to how, like, is it working with the community advisory board? Is it hiring someone who has lived or living experience? Of course, if the award is granted, what does that look like? Does it mean like an employee? Does it mean like a consultant? Are there different ways to engage in consultancy? Another plan is to have the COBRE Special Populations Corps to facilitate the creation of a community ethics board, so that every project that comes through our COBRE will actually be assigned to 2 researchers and 2 community members to provide feedback on the research that's being proposed, and will be able to act as kind of consultants in this, in moving the research forward. And finally, and I will say that this is an area, so for these, for the first 2 bullet points, we have a very kind of solid plan to move forward, and we've had a lot of discussions about it. We're also, for the third bullet point, the COBRE is that we are looking to develop and implement standards of trauma-informed research for our projects. We are really at the beginning stages of figuring that out. We haven't found a lot of great resources, so which speaks even kind of more to the need for this. And I have to say that this was an aspect that was really highlighted when we brought our the 5 principles and 5 questions to our community advisory board. Almost everyone who is in our community advisory board identifies as a person who's in recovery, and spoke specifically to engaging in research when they were actively using. And a number of folks spoke about the way that made them feel, and feeling like that they didn't feel like they had access to the research afterwards, so they didn't have, and this would not have been true, I'm sure, just for people who were using, but that was the experience of our community advisory board, feeling like that they were, it was really, we engaged in this research and then they didn't see people. But also that the questions were, caused trauma for some of the folks. So there was a lot of discussion about, ways to address that, or really just a discussion that it happened. And so we are looking forward to having ongoing conversations with our community advisory board. We're actually looking, Haley McKee and I are talking about, who is coordinating, Haley McKee is with the Special Populations Corps and is coordinating the community advisory board. And we've also been talking about working to specifically engage people who are actively using, perhaps in ways that are maybe separately, because, for a variety of reasons, so that we can sort of continue to have these conversations with folks. So we see this as a very important part of the work that we want to be doing moving forward. John, can you go? Yeah, thank you. So I guess, so we're kind of, if you have the question, where do I start? These are some suggestions sort of broadly. So volunteering. So again, once you have identified the community, your community, then it's reaching out to folks that who are doing the work and volunteering. So for instance, in Rhode Island, if someone is working with folks who are at risk for overdose, say, and there are a number of harm reduction organizations in Rhode Island. Project WV Renew is certainly an example. And there are pathways that are already set up. And not all of the organizations will have this, but many organizations do have, ways in which to just get involved. Can be involved in research, making kits, maybe overdose prevention kits with naloxone, or putting together safe injection kits, et cetera. I mean, there's a variety of volunteer pathways. In Rhode Island, this is certainly the case, and I'm sure it's the case in other states as well. There's a ton of legislative advocacy that can happen. Again, Haley McKee is coordinating our community advisory board. Actually, she was on our community advisory board, and she had, along with AJ Yokin and Lisa Peterson, who form our super PAC here in Rhode Island, have been, are there in the State House during the legislative season, are in the State House every day developing relationships and with legislators, and the super PAC particularly focuses on drug policy. And so they actually do a great job organizing people and engaging people to testify. And they rely a lot, as Haley has said repeatedly, a lot on the research that happens in the state to present to the legislators. Of course, numbers and statistics are not enough for advocacy. We know that, but they are important along with people's stories. So participating or supporting that advocacy work is a key way that people can get to know the different players. Again, once you identify your community. Events like International Overdose Day, Recovery Month, based on your identified community, these are all opportunities for volunteering, maybe not ongoing volunteering, which is a possibility as well, but even just jumping in the day of. I know that, for instance, on International Overdose Awareness Day last year, a number of harm reduction organizations organized a massive naloxone distribution day and distributed over 1,000 kits. And so it was all hands on deck. People who have been trained in overdose prevention and could do that, but who didn't necessarily do it all the time, were certainly important players on that day. And donating to organizations. So certainly it is important for that organizations be reimbursed whenever when you have a grant. But even before having a grant, individuals, of course, if they have the financial capability of doing it, can learn about the different organizations, the work that the organizations are doing, and donate to their work, or go to the events of the different organizations. Again, who is your community, and really learning about the work of the folks, of the community-based organizations. Okay, John. Okay. So I started talking about this already. I kind of jumped the gun, didn't I? The Super PAC is our legislative group working on drug policy reform. And every harm reduction organization in the state is actively involved in their work. And not just the harm reduction organizations, recovery organizations, treatment organizations, different, multiple different organizations are involved in that work. So again, by supporting that legislative effort, it's a way to show up. It's a way to get to know all the different players. Here in Rhode Island, our governor's overdose prevention and intervention task force. There is a monthly meeting, actually it was today, and it is kind of a way to see a snapshot of different work that's going on in the state. Where all the work gets done is in the working groups. So it is possible to do public comment at the task force meetings, but really that's just a way to kind of see who are the different players. Where there's really an opportunity to jump in and get your hands dirty is in the working groups. And there's multiple working groups: the treatment working group, the recovery working group, harm reduction working group, et cetera. And that's, again, a way to get to know the players and actually get involved in the work that's being done in the state. And here in Rhode Island, since July, the legislature passed and the governor signed a harm reduction center legislation. There is a lot of community work at every level to help make sure it happens that a harm reduction center opens. So for people who are here in Rhode Island and want to jump in on that work, there is an opportunity to do that. And so what I would love to do is hear back. Well, first of all, would open it up for people to ask any questions, but I also invite people to share their own experiences in kind of learning and getting involved in their communities and learning and actually engaging in that partnership with the community. So I kind of want to put it to you too for that.
So if folks raise their hand, I can give you access to share share what you've done, your experiences or your insights.
There was a question, actually. Let's see.
Yes,
Lee.
Yeah. So Lee said, what advice do y'all have for young researchers trying to find research groups that take this inclusive approach to transdiagnostic basic research, such as science cafes where community members and researchers gather to work on questions related to just having a brain in general without any particular diagnostic focus?
Oh, wow. That's a good question. There is a reading group that meets, that is run by Brendan Jacka, who is actually participating now. Wait, I go XD. What's that? X is a sponsor. So I mean, that's a great question though. So I can think of, there's like a harm reduction reading group that's happening. And then I think, you know, for instance, we have the COBRE on opioids and overdose. And so we are physically I think it's where there's kind of just a group of people and how to get conversations going. I think, Lee, if that's what I'm understanding, is you're suggesting. And I'm wondering if Alex from People, Places, and Health Collaborative. I mean, in COVID, it's kind of tough, but we've begun seeing each other more. When I say we, the COBRE on opioids and overdose, people are coming in person more often. And I find that even just that is promotes, great, thank you, promotes discussion. And it also happens, so for instance, we just got we just arrived yesterday, we got a FTIR, a drug checking machine, which is a Bruker FTIR. And that is we're meeting to, discuss how do we get to use that. I mean, so I'm thinking that situations like the book club, like getting the FTR, like the harm reduction work group, the harm reduction center, all of these things kind of generate discussion and really the need for moving forward. And people, and Michelle D'Orsay is just suggesting people form their own work groups on this. So I don't know, I certainly open it up to other thoughts.
As Kelly put in the chat, feel free to raise your hand or add thoughts or examples that you know of into the chat for folks to see.
Oh, and okay, just to say that in the chat, if people access the chat, there is the a link to the Recovery and Science Harm Reduction Working Group, which is a collaborative between RICARES and People and Health Collective. Lee, thank you for raising your hand.
Hi, thank you for calling on me, and thank you for this presentation, and this whole symposium has been awesome. Yeah, just to follow up on some of that. So for me, I don't have a lot of truly community engaged research experience. I come from the mouse world, doing a lot of mouse neurobehavioral research, and just kind of noticing that the tests we used had maybe like nothing at all to do with anything that any humans I've ever known have ever found to be relevant. So that was kind of an issue, no offense. but the place where there's been the most fruitful information exchange has been comedy clubs and open mics. And so my kind of, right.
That's great.
It's like, you know, there were funny moments in AA where people tell jokes. That's also, you know, relevant, but just the vibe when people come to a place to laugh, they still share deeply troubling information and work through really hard, weird, tangly shit, but people actually want to go and keep coming back, and it's easier to talk about stuff. So
that's
my
great.
kind of, that's been my experience too. And my kind of pie in the sky research fantasy world is a community center where that's one thing people get to do, is go to a place where they can exchange information in joke form. And I cannot tell you how frustrating it is to try and find the right place to do research where, as you and John said, that science education component is built in, and there's bi-directional communication between scientific experts and lived experience experts. Like, that should be a slam dunk, and I can't find it anywhere, but it would be amazing. And I don't know, any assistance you could provide with just...
Lee, where are you?
Atlanta.
So I can say, I gave the example of the working groups, and I realize that the Governor's Overdose Prevention Task Force is super specific, and I don't know if there's other comparable things in Georgia, but that what is really great about the working groups is that I would welcome people to speak, you know, to speak to this based on their own experience, but it feels like it's a really level playing field. That is a place where that people share, it's sort of moving a ball forward, and researchers or academics are just like they're just one little slice of it. It's really a lot of different folks who come to the table. And so I feel like that is a place that there's the opportunity to have a lot of different voices at the table discussing, and you're there for whatever the topic of the working group is. And other than that, I'm wondering about, like, you know, even political, if there's, it could be around a political movement or a specific, again, around legislative reform, because there will be a lot of different types of voices at the table. I don't know, what do other people think?
Brendan has his hand raised, so see if he can add anything to that.
Thank you so much. Thanks to Michelle for the shout out to the reading group. Lee, I don't have a kind of like an answer for that, but I wanted quickly to talk about the experience with the Community Advisory Board and the COBRE special populations. So I can talk to Lee's question afterwards, but I just wanted to highlight how amazingly helpful the COBRE was with their CAB. As a kind of background, I've been in Rhode Island for about 2 years, so coming in, and my work has historically been population level and clinical research, so not often in the community. So I'm new to learning about US systems and Rhode Island systems and Providence systems. And my research project is looking at people who respond to overdoses that are not professional. So it includes people who do and don't use drugs, people in recovery, peer professionals, the whole range of the community. And so the CAB has been extremely helpful before we started this survey. So in kind of like study startup phase, giving feedback on the survey and the type of questions and information and themes we want to approach. And then also kind of recruitment methods and building my confidence as a researcher to say that we were kind of like on the right track with some modifications. And so that was fantastic before we began. And now we finished recruitment, and on the back end is meeting again with the CAB to talk about not only dissemination, but next steps for research projects. So as a researcher, I have some ideas about what I think would be interesting, but is that actually necessary in the community, or is it just my curiosity? So that conversation is happening in a few weeks, but I've already connected to Michelle and Haley, who are managing the special populations core, to talk about that conversation, to help me frame it and situate it so that we get out the information that we need, rather than just kind of like dump all the information on people. So all around, it's been amazingly helpful. And if anyone has a chance to use these kind of resources, I would definitely say jump at it, because it's kind of tempting to kind of think that I was on the right track, and I may have been like on the track but not on the footpath. But having the support from folks that have been doing this for so long is just mind-blowing. So I just wanted to say thanks to Michelle and Haley and the whole COBRE for that.
Thank you, Brendan. Actually, Brendan, I'm gonna actually, no good deed goes unpunished. I'm gonna ask you to share a little bit, because what I've noticed is that you've been here for 2 years, and so, but I have seen you like a lot of different events, and that you, I mean, for instance, at the recovery, at the recovery event at Roger Williams Park, among many others. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how you sort of jumped into learning about your community and being able to participate in all these different events and things that helped you learn about sort of, and I'm so glad that you've been able to use the community, that you've been able to engage with the community advisory board. But I also know that you have really worked to get to know different communities, and I'd love to hear what your experience has been.
That's a fantastic question. So I think a lot of it at the start was hesitation. I was very concerned about getting in people's way, or not kind of doing harm, but kind of like being in the way or in people's space. And with a lot of encouragement from people, is just kind of like get out there, but kind of be quiet, which I think is fantastic advice. And so kind of early on, within the first few months, we started, Alex, myself and Jackie were talking to John Soske about the harm reduction reading group. And so that was like one conversation talking, so Rye Cares is predominantly recovery focused group. And so that was one introduction, but all of this work is relationship building. So it's kind of like,
That's right,
in my mind, figuring out how people are connected, and knowing that these folks are in the same organization, so I don't need to contact them separately, or kind of like having an awareness of where folks geographically work overlap. So I think it's not jumping in too quickly, but trying to get the information on what folks are doing, and then just kind of like abseiling, jumping off the cliff. And like, people are not going to be scary, but it can definitely seem like it, particularly as a very much an outsider from the country, but you just have to go with it.
Thank you. And actually, Alex, if you don't mind, because you're another newcomer who has really likewise been involved in put in the effort to be get to know your community. And I wonder if you could share a little bit about how you've done that.
Yeah, so for folks on the call, I was actually trained and did my graduate studies in Vancouver, where the research manifesto was created in the downtown east side. So I worked in that drug scene for several years as part of a very kind of well-established community-based research team. So we had a lot of long-standing relationships that I had the benefit of as being a student and a trainee. So I didn't have to necessarily work that hard to get to know folks. It was kind of like you get dragged along and you get to know people. But when I moved to Rhode Island, I hadn't lived in the US in 7 years. I had no I didn't know anybody here. And so I really was lucky in getting some first introductions from folks on our team to people like Colleen. I think Colleen was one of the first folks I met. And kind of from there, I just started emailing people and be like, hi, I'm new. Like, can I pop by and learn about your organization? And so it was just a lot of like speed dating almost, like, hi, I'm Alex. Like, tell me about what you're doing. You know, it's great to meet you. I'm here and I just want to learn. So it was a lot of kind of meeting with people, and then just trying to ask, like, who else should I be talking to? Like, you know, who else do you work with? So I kind of met folks in the housing world and the harm reduction world, and Rhode Island's small, which has been useful. So, you know, I believe John introduced me to you, Michelle, and we had coffee. And so it's like, it really forced me. I'm an introvert, so I struggle sometimes really kind of getting out there. But it's all about relationships, and it was, you know, trying to do it the right way of just slowing down and just learning versus being like, I'm new, I want to do this research, be my partner, which is, you know, not an ideal approach necessarily. I have a question. I'm going to use my moderator privilege in this last few minutes. And I was hoping you, in the presentation, you and John made this distinction between, so we often hear about community-based research, or community-engaged research, or community-focused research, but y'all made this very kind of blunt distinction between that and community-empowered research. And I think that's really powerful. And I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit more about what that looks like, what community-empowered work, how y'all are envisioning it, and how researchers can make sure that kind of community-facing or co-developed research really has that empowering piece to it.
Yeah, thank you, Alex. I think that was really the distinction, was that it was co-determined, that the research, that the goal would be it's research that has been, that's not top down, but comes from a relationship with the community. And honestly, that is possible through having really being willing to put in the time. And so when you were, for instance, giving the example of going around and talking to people and figuring out, you know, where, you know, what are the different events that are happening? Where can I volunteer? Where can I spend time, again, in the community that I have devoted myself to? Then those relationships develop, and you have an opportunity to ask questions. What is, you know, and from the conversations that happen, from the activities, from the where people are within both the members of the community and the organizations within the community, where are they devoting their time, energy, and effort? You actually get to see that and be, and that's how you learn. And of course, through having conversations. And that's sort of where then the research bubbles up from. And I think that's sort of where it's community empowered research. But John, I'm going to hand it over to you.
We had a lot of discussion about structure, right? There's community engaged researches out there as a framework. There's participatory action research. There's all of these different frameworks that are now coming, being promoted by funders to incorporate community engagement. Starts really in the 90s in the development world in sub-Saharan Africa, but there's a lot of buzz around it now. But and some people wanted us to take a more manualized, structured approach. And instead we settled on principles for a number of reasons. One, because we felt like each community we work with is different, but also each type of project is different. Some of us are doing ethnography, some of us are doing much more structured social science, some of us are even doing things that approach basic science, so that there was no manualized or checklist way of doing what we feel like needs to be done, which is a kind of reflexivity at every stage of the research. And so the notion of community empowered research was in part one to get away from a kind of checkbox approach where it's like, all right, I presented to a CAB once, this is community engaged research and I can go on. Or, you know, I've written John or Michelle into my grant for 0.00005% FTE or whatever it is. You know what I mean? And that counts as consulting a person with lived experience, and instead say, all right, if you start with this set of principles and apply them to each stage of your research, how can you open up this process? And, you know, what we've seen is when that happens, the relationship between community members and researchers generates new and fresh ideas. And I think like some of the work Brooke Rogers has done with Weber Renew around counseling and peer support during COVID-19, all of that came out of work that was being done together that produced research ideas and produced really, really interesting papers. So I think we worry that the move to community engaged research almost is becoming colonial in certain cases. It's like funders want to see proof of community engagement. People show up with resources on a very short time frame to community organizations that need the resources and want the connections, but often have to twist themselves into knots so that they fit the agenda of the researchers. And so we're, more than anything, we're posing the question, what if the initiative in the agency comes the other way? What would it actually take for the research process and program to be driven by the communities on the ground? I don't think we have a fully worked out framework for that, but I think that's the challenge we want to put on the table and try to live up to. And I do think at our best, that's what Alex and Brendan and Michelle and Haley and do.
So Colleen has her hand raised. Okay.
Hi. Yeah, this has been so exciting to hear, you know, all of the work that you all have put into this. And I just wanted to sort of talk a little bit about what Alex was speaking about when she first came to meet with us, because I think that was a really good indicator of how to be a researcher and to how to sort of meet with a community-based organization, which is to say, I have this expertise. However, I'm not an expert in your community. I'm not an expert in what you do. What can I learn from you? What can I give to you to help make your work easier and better? And I just think that that has been the experience that we've had with so many researchers, which is that they say, we have institutional power. So we have the power of the purse at Brown. We have, you know, we have the COBRE. We have sort of some institutional power. How can we use that power to meet the needs or to advance the needs of the community that you all are serving or that you all are from? And so I just think that that's what I appreciate most about Brendan and Alex and Michelle and all of the folks who are doing all of this research work, is that they're essentially saying, can our research be used like John said, for an advocacy purpose? Can we use this for to advance a legislative agenda? Can we use this for financial assistance for the work that is on the ground? Can we use this for, what is the best use of this? Can we do data entry, which Michelle talked about for the Overdose Awareness Day, where we had thousands of Narcan units that we gave out, and somebody needed to do the data entry. And so Alex and the whole team did the data entry for all of those kits. And that's the kind of stuff that, you just show up and you say, what can I do to advance the agenda of the community that the community has already identified? And so I really appreciate you all for that. And I think it is why I'm so excited about this, sharing this with a larger audience.
Thank you, Colleen.
I also just want to point to the fact that the COBRE Special Populations Corps employs 3 people in recovery, one of whom is formally incarcerated. And actually, how many academic spaces that work on substance use have no one who's openly in recovery? That in fact, people who are in recovery are actually scared to disclose because of the kind of stigma that they would face. I mean, the CAS at Brown has not a single person who's openly in recovery employed there. So that's community empowerment too. Are you hiring and making space for people who are actually from the community to play a leading role in this work? And a lot of the next stage of what we're going to do is really trying to build the infrastructure to mentor and train community members to develop research skills. We really think that's the future. And some of that's going to be institutional work too, about like fighting to get people hired who have incarceration histories, right? Fighting against drug checks. Right, as ways of screening out people from being hired. So that Michelle and I didn't talk a lot about that today, but that's really part of this agenda, is thinking about the institutional changes we're going to have to make in order to make more space within like the COBRE or other structures for community members to actually get paid for their expertise and learn a set of skills to drive this work forward.
I think something else that we didn't really talk about, but I think that an important part of putting yourself out there, or certainly when you go out, when you're going to meet with the organizations, is sort of positioning yourself within the research in terms of, you know, if it feels safe to say I'm a person in recovery, or I use, or I am a person that is manages mental health issues, or I am a person who have experienced homelessness or incarceration, or I mean, because, you know, we all have different reasons that we come to the research that we come to. So it's like, where is even kind of being able to, if we're willing to ask, if we're going to ask participants, or if we're going to ask of other people really sort of probing questions, I think we need to be able to talk about that for ourselves as well, and share that. But I guess, as John's suggesting, it has to be safe. And so I guess that's, you know, how do we work to create safe spaces within our offices, within our academic settings, so that there isn't that much, because honestly, it depends, of course we have, but all of us bring something, right? I mean, that's just a reality. And so how do we make the spaces to be able to talk about that and identify ourselves more with the work that we're doing?
Well, that's fantastic. So are there any other kind of final questions or comments from the attendees? If you raise your hand, I can unmute you, or feel free to pop something in the chat. Well, John and Michelle, you answered just kind of organically the other questions that I had come up with, but I just want to thank you both for highlighting this. It's a really critical topic, and I think it poses a lot of challenges, but having space to have meaningful discussions around this is really how we change institutions and make work that's useful for our communities. So I just want to thank you both for taking the time to share that with us.